Sorry I didn't give you a cue there, Eric. Welcome to everybody, again, on behalf of the Center for Public Theology and Public Policy here at Yale Divinity School. We are really glad to have everybody who's here in the room and people who are joining us remotely for this conversation about policy that impacts all of our communities, and especially policy that addresses poverty and inequality in this country. The Center for Public Theology and Public Policy, as you can probably tell from the name, is very committed here at the Divinity School to exploring the questions of how our commitments, our faith commitments to God and to one another connect with the way we engage with the world, especially the way that we collectively shape the world through policy. And we have been, for the past 2 years here, cultivating conversations where people who do research and who practice in fields related to public life, what's being learned about policy in those spaces, but also what theologians and biblical scholars are drawing from the text and from conversations in our faith communities about our moral obligations. And putting those in conversation with one another is really important to what we're trying to do. So it's really the desire of this conversation today to kind of start that conversation up here and to bring you all into it. And Reverend Barber, Reverend William Barber, our founding director, was scheduled to be here and to host this conversation. Unfortunately, he is sick today and has been ordered to bed rest by his doctor, and so he's following those orders, and we're going to do our best to keep this conversation going and to honor what he had hoped for this to be. So I am here in his stead, certainly not filling in or replacing him, but I'll do my best. Which I'd like to start by introducing the people who are going to start our conversation. And I'll introduce all three and then invite you to come up and take your seats. So we have with us today Alan Curtis, my apologies. Alan Curtis from the Eisenhower Foundation, who is going to introduce an important policy project that's been going on for decades now as really an extension of the work that was done with the original Kerner Commission. And so he'll share more about that. But there is a recent update of the consistent reporting they've been doing on the best research about policy across many areas that impact inequality, and it's called Creating Justice. So in many ways, we're going to kind of center our conversation around what is in this most recent report, which he'll tell us about, called Creating Justice. We also are delighted to have our colleague from the law school, Elizabeth Hinton, who is here, and who is an expert on how various forces responded to the policy proposals of the Kerner Commission and what that led to in the immediate decade or so after that. She's written whole books on this, but she will distill all of it and help us to kind of bring it into conversation with this today. And we're also delighted to have our colleague from, if you haven't been over to the center, we're just next door in this building, and share that space with the Center for Faith and Culture, which Miroslav Volf directs. He is a theologian, but also a very engaged theologian that's interested in these questions of how our faith plays out in public life. So we'll get into, for all of you theology students, we'll get into sort of where does theology touch on these policy issues, and we'll invite him to lead us into that. So let me invite all of you up here, and I will hand the microphone over to Alan. Please greet all of our panelists warmly as they come. There you go. I think you're live there, so.
Good afternoon. I have the boring part. I'm going to give you a prepared talk. The best part will come afterwards when we have the informal back and forth.
Well, you're going to give us something to talk about, so thank you.
Yeah, but I apologize for giving the formal part. But I appreciate this opportunity to be with you all as we continue really to honor this week the legacy of Dr. King. A fortnight ago, I sat in a Washington National Cathedral pew at the funeral of President Jimmy Carter. Ahead of my wife and myself, all 5 of the living presidents were sitting next to the flag-draped coffin: Biden, Bush, Clinton, Obama, and Trump. It was a powerful scene. Did these men really agree on anything? Could they agree on the honor, integrity, and morality of President Carter, perhaps? I asked myself. Honor, integrity, and morality, these are themes integral to this afternoon's forum, and I wish really to deeply thank Jonathan and Bishop Barber for organizing it. Thank you as well to Professor Hinton, Professor Volf for presenting, and for Elizabeth for the work she's already done with us on this project and for her inspiration in the field. My role today then is to briefly overview creating justice in a multiracial democracy, which is the name of our new update of the 1968 Kerner Commission, which was, the book was just published by Columbia Teachers College Press. In response to the disturbances in over 150 cities in the 1960s, President Lyndon Johnson formed the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, the Kerner Commission, which was chaired by the governor of Illinois, Otto Kerner. Most of those commissioners were privileged white men, yet the commission warned in 1968 that America was heading towards, quote, 2 societies, black and white, separate and unequal. And the commission warned against white racism. The commission concluded, it is time to make good the promises of American democracy to all citizens, urban and rural, black and white, Spanish surname, American Indian, and every minority group, unquote. It still is time, of course, and we are very aware of how Dr. King and Senator Robert Kennedy endorsed the Kerner Commission in 1968, and then they both were assassinated in that terrible year. In our new Creating Justice update, we return to Kerner priorities, and we're focused on the long run. We offer a baseline against which to measure progress or lack of progress over the years to come, and especially over the next 4 years. We will hold the federal government accountable for reducing economic inequality, poverty, and racial injustice over those 4 years. We will communicate common sense feedback from Americans at the grassroots. We will be mindful of how the system is increasingly dominated by billionaires. The Kerner Commission concluded in 1968 that we know a great deal about what works to reduce economic inequality, poverty, and racial injustice in poor and working class neighborhoods. Based on decades of evaluation since, we know much more today about what works. Yet the 2024 presidential campaign did not thoughtfully debate what works and what doesn't work. As editor of Creating Justice, let me share with you just a few examples of failure to discuss these things in the 2024 election. Campaign dialogue and media coverage spent little time in 2024 on how federal, state, and local policies need to be based on facts, science, and evidence, not on supposition, denial, misinformation, and disinformation. Yet perhaps the most urgent moral issue of our time is getting a firm hold on what is true and what is false. Truth remains truth. Lies remain lies. Without access to the truth, we cannot make wise decisions in our public life. I say this, of course, as Facebook and X have dismantled fact-checking. What about the other 2024 campaign failures? A few examples. The 1968 Kerner Commission gave first priority to wise decisions on economic policy. By contrast, why was there such a failure in the 2024 campaign to communicate how poor, working class, and middle class Americans have been exploited by the rich, the privileged, and corporations, especially since the 1980s? Insufficient media attention was given to the dramatic reductions in taxes paid by the richest Americans and corporations since the Eisenhower administration in the 50s, and to the massive increase in wealth inequality and income inequality that has since resulted. The tax rate for the 400 richest Americans now is lower than the tax rate for the bottom half of American income earners. It's lower. Why wasn't that adequately debated in 2024, especially in light of how public opinion polls have shown that poor working class and middle class citizens are deeply concerned about inequality? We now have a tech industrial complex that matches the military industrial complex. We now have a new Gilded Age oligarchy with mind-numbing conflicts of interest. The 2024 campaign and its media coverage did not sufficiently debate the failure of trickle-down economics. The myth of trickle-down market fundamentalism has been called zombie economics by Nobel Prize winners because tax breaks for the rich and corporations keep coming back to life again and again in spite of their evidence-based past failures. As a result of the 2024 election, zombie economic policy now is exploding still again, disproportionately punishing the working class, low-income people, and the middle class. Fortunately, in recent years, a new economic mindset has been evolving. It is bubble up, not trickle down. It gives priority to low-income, working class, and middle class families. It is designed to bring manufacturing jobs back to America. It is woven into new industrial and new antitrust policy. And there is some bipartisan support, yet why wasn't there genuine debate during the election campaign over how bubble up has worked and trickle down has failed? And why isn't there any debate today? The 1968 Kerner Commission gave equally high priority to education policy, yet the 2024 campaign and its media coverage had little to say about how K-12 school segregation has increased since Kerner. It's increased. Reading and math achievement gaps between whites and people of color have increased. Absenteeism in the school-to-prison pipeline has grown, and school vouchers have failed based on careful evaluations. There was almost no 2024 campaign dialogue on reauthorizing federal support for proven grassroots mentoring and tutoring to close the school achievement gap. No attention to reauthorizing the child tax credit legislation that reduced poverty by half during the pandemic, but then shamefully was not reorganized. There was no attention paid to scaling up the early education and community school programs that have been rigorously evaluated as successful. No attention to reversing the national teacher shortage, which grew worse during the pandemic, and no attention paid to reforming K-12 school financing based on the life status of students rather than on local property taxes. Beyond the need for wise economic and education policy that creates justice, why did the 2024 campaign not debate police reform, mass incarceration, the prison industrial complex, and gun control? Why did the 2024 campaign not debate the record surge in homelessness nationally to almost 20%? Why did the 2024 campaign not acknowledge how poor people in America can expect to die 12 years sooner than rich people? I'm simply illustrating here that from the perspective of our new update, Creating Justice, there was so little discussion in the 2024 campaign of what works and what doesn't work in economic, education, criminal justice, housing, and public health policy. Accordingly, in our criminal justice update, we lay out successful and unsuccessful policy in each of these domains. Yet identifying what works is not enough. The 1968 Kerner Commission warned that to legislate, fund, and implement what works at a scale equal to the dimensions of the problem, we need new political will in America. New political will. Sadly, today, we still need new will. What then are some of the strategies to create new will that we suggest in Creating Justice? We need to strengthen the democracy of voting. On balance, electoral democracy was better defended in 2024 than in 2020. But we need to be extremely vigilant now. Billionaire-backed advocacy groups continue to lobby hard for new state-level legislation designed to block voter turnout. We need to build on the grassroots evidence and experience of political strategist Annette Schenker-Osorio. In Creating Justice, Annette shows how messaging to voters in local campaigns for office can be successful at integrating both issues of class and issues of race. Such messaging can reinforce Kerner priorities. That messaging needs to better utilize how majorities of Americans across classes and races believe the privileged and corporations should pay more taxes and support child tax credits, preschool for all children, paid family leave, women's reproductive rights, expansion of labor unions, and a $15 federal minimum wage. These are all Creating Justice and Kerner priorities. As Bishop Barber and Jonathan have shared with us in their important new book, White Poverty, the creation of new will requires mass mobilization of the poor and near poor in elections. The mobilization needs to be around issues the poor and the near poor support, like higher wages, better schools, effective gun control, and police reform. We need to recognize that the poverty rate is higher for blacks than for whites, but the number of people in poverty is higher for whites than for blacks. So there is potential, perhaps, for alliance. We need to build on the recent YouGov survey that shows working-class Americans are supportive of many Kerner and Creating Justice priorities. And we need to reinforce how the economic justice movement created by Dr. King and continued by Bishop Barber identifies common ground between people of color and whites. Better mobilizing these and related constituencies to create new will means not just persuading people to vote, it also means better motivating more criminal Creating Justice and Kerner supportive citizens to run for office. Here the model for the future is reorganization of the progressive leadership pipelines formed by the late and great Senator Paul Wellstone through his nonprofit organization, Wellstone Action. We need to train. We need to create a new Department of Democracy, as advocated by Black Voters Matter co-founder Latosha Brown in Creating Justice. The mission of the Department of Democracy should include significantly reducing misinformation and disinformation in our democratic dialogue. One model we need to follow is Finland, which has successfully implemented K-12 evidence-based curricula to teach students how to recognize and deal with misinformation and disinformation. In our advocacy, we need to reverse new congressional action in America that has blocked development of such curricula. This has been done to block, for example, curricula development at Stanford. The Department of Democracy should also take the lead in better implementing evidence-based policy. Governor Wes Moore of Maryland, who wrote the Forward to Creating Justice, is spearheading the evidence-based movement at the state level. Governor Moore is partnering with the nonprofit Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy and with the Arnold Foundation and Eisenhower. Although it will not be easy, new will means we need to fight for the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act. And we need to advance underlying structural reform to the democratic system, however long that takes. We need, for example, to eliminate gerrymandering, legislate campaign finance reform, ban dark money, abolish the Electoral College, and create Supreme Court term limits. For new will, we need to reinforce our support of the Third Reconstruction of Bishop Barber. If he were here with us, he would be speaking today of moral fusion through his shared and self-reinforcing multi-leader and multi-organization movement focused on changing the rigged and exploitive American system. We need to speak with Birmingham jail outrage, reaffirm our humanity with intensity, become more forceful in making the privileged uncomfortable, and draw power from suffering. If he were here, Bishop Barber would be much more eloquent on these terms. Instead of Jimmy Carter honor, integrity and moral conduct in America, today we have exploitation and denial. Deniers tend to be masters of the illusory truth effect, which, in the words of Harvard Kennedy School professor Nancy Gibbs, holds that people are more likely to believe something true or not if they hear it over and over again. So today, 1 in 4 members of Congress denies climate change, and 147 senators and representatives voted to deny the results of the 2020 election. American universities need to create new will by awakening the vision of President John Kennedy when, in his inaugural address, he motivated us to ask what we can do for our country. President Kennedy urged, "Let public service be a proud and lively career, and let every man and woman who works in any area of our national government be able to say with pride and with honor in future years, I served the United States government in that hour of our nation's greatest need." Responding to the Kennedy challenge, universities today must re-inspire the best students to serve in government and partner with local nonprofits to create justice. And they need to do the Barred Prison Initiative. Finally, following the lead of Bishop Barber and the Mellon and Ford Foundations, we need to enhance how the visual and the performing arts can better create new will. For example, by learning from the artist-driven activism of Hank Willis Thomas and his Four Freedoms Collaborative, which was inspired by President Franklin Roosevelt. These then are just a few examples of how to create new will to scale up what works. But we really need, right now, this afternoon, are your ideas and your creativity to provide momentum for the Creating Justice movement as we speak across the nation and abroad in 2025 and 2026. When it comes then to reducing economic inequality, poverty, and racial injustice, What we need from you today is a moral commitment to the dream. What will happen to the dream? And what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Perhaps that dream just sags like a heavy load. Or, my friends, does it just explode? Thank you.
Thank you so much. The moment demands the poetry of a century ago, and demands the kind of attention that you've given to this. Let me just say, you know, here at the center, we are committed to the language you used of moral fusion, and the fusion is always about bringing different people together, but it's also about bringing together a way of talking about our common life where we recognize that there are all kinds of different policy that impact the community, right? And one of the things I appreciate about creating justice, and Alan has just given us a really nice overview of something that you can dive deeper into by you know, getting there's a whole set of chapters on any one of these topics, but by putting it all together, you really do help us to see that the policies we're talking about all kind of intersect with one another, and that they're so, that the way they impact our lives is so intimately woven with the public stories we tell, yes. Right? So there's disinformation, there's all kinds of story building that's happening, and we have in the room here a whole lot of people who are training to be storytellers. You know, that's a lot of what preachers do. That's a lot of what public moral leaders do. They tell us stories. And so I hope that kind of as this conversation goes on, we can both dig into this sort of wide range of policies and talk about what do we know about what makes a difference, because that's a striking thing to say we know more today than we did in '68, and yet in some ways we're less equipped to implement them. And a lot of that has to do with this whole issue of public will and the stories that we have been told and the stories that we tell about what's possible. So I wanted to bring Elizabeth into the conversation because she's done so much as a historian on the stories that get told. So talk to us about what stories were told to push back against Kerner initially, and kind of how you see that at work in the world right now.
Well, first, Jonathan, thank you so much for convening us and inviting me to participate. I'm really honored to be here. Thank all of you also for coming and joining this critical conversation. And Alan, thank you for bringing me into the very important work that you're doing around the Kerner Commission, and for your inspiring and powerful remarks this afternoon. You know, the ultimate response to, I argue in my research, the ultimate response to the Kerner Commission and the moment of, the high moment of progressive social change and civil rights revolution in this country was mass criminalization, was the expansion of policing in targeted low-income, poor communities of color, the expansion of surveillance, especially in those communities, but surveillance in general in American society, and of course the vast and marked expansion of our prison system, ultimately, you know, making the United States the world's leading incarcerator, but framing the long-term response to the civil rights movement, to progressive social change, to demographic change in American society, in a moment when policymakers at the very highest level of government and liberal policymakers like Lyndon Johnson were presented by the Kerner Commission with alternatives and with an entirely different set of investments that they could have made, right? Instead of investing in police, instead of investing in a job creation program for police officers with the war on crime, instead of investing in a job creation program for low-income people of color, right, the federal government invests in a job creation program for police officers with the programs of the war on crime. So there was an alternative path. It's not like we didn't have the resources to do it. And, you know, a decision was made to go in this path, on the punitive path, on the criminalizing path, of course, with vast consequences for generations of low-income people and people of color in particular. And we see now, you know, that path, I mean, this has been building for decades, really since the Reagan administration, but, you know, we're really, it seems like this administration is amping up that path to systematically detain migrants. I think one of the most striking examples, or one of the most striking examples of the way that the Kerner Commission's work was kind of warped, to me, appears in the way that during the Nixon administration, beginning in 1970, policymakers began to project and predict that the prison population, that the prisons in the United States would expand. And their basis for these projections and predictions were in part informed by population projections that the Kerner Commission made that later proved to be false. The Kerner Commission projected that the fastest growing population in the United States was Black youth between the ages of 15 and 24, which happened to be the kind of like same population, especially in the mid-1960s, that policymakers were very worried about, that policymakers saw as responsible for crime in the nation, and used this prediction to essentially anticipate the growth of the US prison system, the subsequent investment at the federal level and at all levels of government in the prison system. So the federal government starts giving, beginning in 1970, when these projections and predictions are being made, essentially 75% off coupons to states to build new prisons. And of course, this is in the decade leading up to Ronald Reagan. So much of the, I mean, that kind of ties it right there. Instead of saying, okay, you know, let's create jobs, instead, federal policymakers chose to create prisons. And by the end of the decade, and this is, you know, an incredibly cynical approach to policy, when those same projections about Black youth populations proved to be false, policymakers started using unemployment figures to predict and project prison populations, which really, from any kind of a moral, ethical sense, makes no sense. You know, when I was seeing the archives around this, and if you're interested, this is all detailed in my first book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, including some images of these projections in the documents from the Nixon administration that I discovered. I couldn't wrap my head around how you could project for prison populations in the first place. How can you project that people are going to commit crimes? How can you project that prisons are going to grow? Shouldn't the assumption be based on something else? But it makes no sense that the response to unemployment, if you know that unemployment is a predictor of crime, would be building prisons rather than just giving people jobs. But this is the kind of mislogic policy that has guided, right, all of the paths that Alan was talking about. And I think, you know, it's not like it's not as if we don't have alternatives. I think that the attention that you pay to taxes. You know, a lot of people say, well, we don't have money to do this. Yes, we do. If we tax differently, we would have all kinds of new, if we tax corporations fairly, we would have a very robust social welfare state that would change basic conditions that the poorest people in the United States are facing. Everybody in this country, everybody around the world should have the right to clean water. That's not something that everybody in the United States enjoys. Working plumbing, access to robust educational opportunities. And the systematic denial of these educational opportunities, the systematic denial of being able to tell truthful stories about how we got here so we can figure out how we might create a better future, is again part of this long-term project to maintain elite power, to maintain racial hierarchies in the United States, and prevent us from coming closer to a more equally distributed, robust multiracial democracy that the Kerner Commission envisioned, and that Dr. King and Dr. Barber and others live out in the work that they do in the society that they help us get closer to building every day.
Can I ask you, Elizabeth, so you're telling a story about how policy decisions shaped the lives of communities that were over-policed and people that went to prison. I mean, I live in a neighborhood where for a whole generation, every family had somebody that went to prison. Right. This reshaped whole communities. Yep. We talk a lot at the center about shifting the moral narrative in order to build this new will. What moral narrative was necessary to convince people that those were the policies that were needed?
Yeah, so, and this is, again, I think something that the Kerner Commission had attempted to intervene on. The idea, and this is a long-held narrative in the American public and political imagination that really begins to emerge immediately after emancipation, the linking of blackness with criminality, the long-standing idea that black people, that people of color are inherently violent and are inherently a threat to American democracy. I think one of the big questions of U.S. history, especially from the perspective of white political elites, are what are we going to do with free black people? I mean, there's a constant fear, and many of the laws enacted from slavery on has been trying to prevent any kind of political mobilization, organizing, dismantling of the racial hierarchies that have structured this nation historically. So that question of what to do with free black people as it gets kind of navigated in the post-emancipation period and beyond is to link blackness with criminality. Mm-hmm. So instead of, a big part of my work, especially in my second book, and of course the Kerner Commission was formed in response to what I call the rebellions of the 1960s, which really, I think should be seen as a form of political violence that emerged in response of the unfinished, unfulfilled promises of the civil rights movement that didn't, much like the Reconstruction period, due to the limitations of federal policy, gave people political enfranchisement without economic enfranchisement. So the lack of economic change, things I've been talking about, the lack of educational opportunities, jobs, decent housing for people, policies that meet people's basic needs and also, include full political and economic inclusion in U.S. society. That's what that violence was about. When people for decades, try nonviolent direct action protests, try lawsuits, try petitions, and it doesn't work, and you're getting abused by police, and you have no recourse, you've tried the other route, the response is violence. And instead of taking a step back and saying, okay, let's really look at this, as the Kerner Commission did, let's try to understand what are the root causes of this violence. The Kerner Commission, of course, famously identified it as white racism and socioeconomic inequality rather than black pathology. When you dig in and you understand that that's the root cause, that these are rebellions, that they're not riots, that they're not criminal acts, then that allows us to think about a whole range of solutions outside of more policing and law enforcement, which of course is the catalyst for many of these incidents in the first place. So the narrative, though, and this is why I think the terminology is so important around the word riot, because when we use the word riot, then these acts are criminal, they need to be punished. The people that enact them are inherently criminal, and the solution is policing, right? And I think that's been the kind of story of, when this was in question in the 1960s, by the 1970s, especially with, Nixon on, and liberal presidents since Nixon, have kind of adopted this idea that certain groups, minoritized groups in U.S. society are inherently criminal, and the best way to manage the problems of poverty and inequality is to lock people up, remove them from their communities, and warehouse them in prisons that are usually located very, very far away from their home communities for extremely, extremely long sentences. So the thing that sustains that, and of course we see it in the rhetoric around migrants and immigration, is that, you know, certain groups of people deserve this because they are criminals. And that's an old trope that we see through as history. When you criminalize people, then you can legally and through political and policy frameworks enact undue harm upon them.
Yeah, thank you.
As opposed to your work, Elizabeth, one of the most destructive academics was John DiIlio, a professor, who coined the notion that, yes, for the future, we're going to see more and more predators.
Yep.
And predators meant young black men. And that word, that phrase and associated phrases, that word predators, got picked up by the media, which loved it. And that was really responsible for much of what Elizabeth is talking about.
Can I just add one thing on that before we move on? I think like where you see that in action, and thank you so much for making that point, Alan, is that, you know, like in the early 90s when these things are being, when the idea of the super predators coming out and all of these horrible policies that really lead to, you know, the drastic explosion in the US prison population, we get the system where mass incarceration is essentially about locking up, systematically locking up black and brown children and teenagers, super predators, for most of their adult lives in faraway prisons. That's what mass incarceration, it's taking black children and teenagers under these kind of like ideas of super predator ideas and just putting them in prison for most of their lives. That's what it is.
And the super predator professor later apologized.
Yep, because it was wrong, just like the same statistics that were used to justify the kind of beginnings of mass incarceration in the 1970s, the preparation for it and the expansion and investment into prisons.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. One of the things about the super predator is that that is a character that's created to tell a moral story, right? Because no one ever wants to do something for nefarious reasons, right? People want to do what they do for the best of reasons. So you need this character of the super predator in order to, you know, rally the troops to protect these people, whoever these people are. In this case, you know, innocent white children who might be subject to, you know, this predator's advances. So, yeah, these moral narratives are always at play. And Miroslav, you know very well that they're connected to our scripture texts, our faith stories. Yeah, how do you want to enter this conversation as somebody who thinks about these things from that side?
First thing,
let's get you on. I might take a flip of that switch.
Flip of that switch.
You can use mine.
There we go. There we go.
Trade me, and then you can.
Here we do go.
There we go.
Okay. I'll hold. First, I want to just thank Jonathan, you, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. As you will very soon know, I'm no expert on this issue. As my fellow panelists here are. I speak as an amateur. I speak as a person who is really interested in the question, who's moved by the question, who wants to bring some of the theological resources to bear on the question, and even there, this is not my specialization. Just a very important concern. And as I was listening to introductory comments, also comments by Elizabeth, somehow I had a sense, especially also reading the book, we know so much about the causes of poverty, and evidence-based action should be a relatively clear thing for us to do. And yet, after I finished reading, especially the introduction to the book, where it is, we know we should, we need to, and it's rhetoric is there that's kind of carrying me with, and I realize, well, but we are not. And so the immediate question for me was, and this has been a question that plagued me over the many decades, is why not? Why not, and why has, if I read things rightly culturally, and certainly that is true within Christian communities, why has the situation in fact deteriorated? And you can see it also just by looking at, say, evangelical community and how the assessment of inequality. Some of you will know the name of John Stott. He died a few years back. He is the Mr. Evangelical in the 80s, I think mid-80s. He wrote a book on kind of moral issues facing Christians, and one of those issues was the issue of inequality. And then he proposed there, as a kind of a reasonable proposal, that the discrepancy between the lowest paid and highest paid employee in an organization should be 1 to 7. Now, if you look at it from current perspective, this is clear Marxism. There can be a communism, right? This is unimaginable that one would even think in those terms. And it's also the same in any communities that you look. And the question is why? Why is it the case? Why can Pope Benedict XVI call the poor the first, God's first love, and yet that all leaves everybody kind of indifferent, as if it meant virtually nothing? We don't believe the Pope, we don't believe in God, at least we don't believe in that God whose first love are the poor. And so for me, the really fundamental question where I sit, this is not the only question, certainly, but fundamental question where I sit is why? What are some of the reasons for this abandonment of the poor? And one of the books that I found very, very helpful, I don't know if you're familiar with it, maybe some of you are, it's called Aporophobia. And subtitle is Why We Reject the Poor Instead of Helping Them. It's a Spanish moral philosopher. And she starts, the aporophobia means the fear of the poor. Xenophobia, homophobia, aporophobia, and she coined that term. The reason she coined that term is because she thought we need to have a term for something that is actually real but is not recognized, that we actually fear not simply of foreigners, not simply people who have different practices than we do, sexual and otherwise, but we fear also people who are poor. And so she traces this fear for the poor in the contrast during the Brexit in Europe. There was obviously rhetoric against the immigrants, as we experience the rhetoric right now was high. But immigrants who were doctors and professionals were exempt from that rhetoric. Immigrants in Spain who came from England and were retirees with good chunk of change to spend, they were exempt from that rhetoric. And then she realized that there is this category of the poor, and she asked the question, why is it that we have this phobia of the poor? I'm not necessarily wedded completely to her answer, but I think that's the right question to ask. And what she suggests is that we live in kind of economies of mutual benefit. And the poor are perceived as the ones who cannot benefit anyone. And because they cannot benefit other people, or at least middle class, things that poor can be of no benefit to them. And therefore, one can turn away from them and practically go one's own way. So in a sense, the poor are not keeping their part of the social bargain. is the basic idea that informs this. She goes into biological reasons for that and so forth, and you can read the book if you're interested. Now, I think when we live, I think it's true today, not just in societies of kind of mutual benefit, as a kind of social imaginary, not as reality. If we imagine ourselves to live in societies like that, we don't do just that. We also live in performance societies, so that we constantly need to up our performance in order to be competitive. And if we fail to do that, we fall behind. And then suddenly the poor are not only not doing their share, but poor emerge as those who do not, who kind of drag us back and don't allow us to be in the position in which we hope to find ourselves and in a position toward which we aspire. And that struck me then, reminded me of a text that I read. Some of you will know that I'm here, students will know that I'm a fan of Martin Luther, of two Martin Luthers. One is the king, and the other one is not quite the king, the reformer.
But a namesake, according to the family.
A namesake, yes. That's right. And he's written a commentary on Magnificat, which is to say the song of Mary when she was pregnant and she visited Elizabeth. And in that song, she praises God for turning the tables in many ways, of power, of wealth. And Luther is writing then a commentary on that. By the way, just a footnote, I'm totally amazed always when I think of that song being placed in the mouth of Mary. From Nazareth, I think 400 built houses in that place, at the very edge of an empire. And what is she dreaming about? God taking down the great, the mighty from their thrones and establishing the messianic kingdom. It's amazing what a scope of imagination is evidenced just in that song of that 17, 15, whatever, how old young girl that she was. Now, Luther writes commentary, and he begins by discussing about nature of God, the mighty one, who undoes the differences between those who have and those who have not, have power, have resources, and those who have not. And then he writes, well, God is the highest. And this is typical of Luther's writing. And by the way, he is writing this text to his immediate political superior. So this is a political tract that he is actually writing, placing it in his hands. And so he writes, God is the Almighty, which is, or the highest, which means, what does God do when God is the highest? God does not look up, because there's nothing and nobody up. God does not look to one side or the other, because there's no one who is equal to him. The only place where God can look is God can look down. And then Luther said, the further down you are, the better God sees you. which is marvelous statement about concern for those who are kind of nobodies of this world. And then he makes a comment, but what do we tend to do? Well, we always tend to look up, which is to say, wherever there is power, wherever there is wealth, wherever there is knowledge, that's where I aspire to be. With that is what we identify. And we flee from contact with that which is weak, with that which is broken, with that which is hungry, and so forth, that which has a claim on us, which will not take us up, but which somehow we perceive as it will take us down. And it would seem to me that we need to, at least in the Christian tradition, we need to rediscover this commitment for that which is low down, so that we can lift the people up from where they find ourselves. Otherwise, where is the will? That's what I always ask. And that's the great, great question that always, in many domains of our lives, troubles us. We know stuff, but will is weak, and sometimes even when we try, it's broken. And I think this nurturing of the moral imagination, of what it is that is the highest actually, and what the highest is that does. What does the highest do? As well as nurturing ourselves, a sense that we are truly and fully ourselves when we align ourselves with purposes of God, when we are not afraid of the poor, but go and encounter the poor and be with them and lift them up. All of us have stories I shouldn't say that. I have a story, and some of my friends told me similar stories, where you think you are immune to this. I'll tell you just very briefly about my own story of being afraid of the poor. I was traveling from Kosovo with my wife, traveling from Kosovo in former Yugoslavia, from Kosovo through Skopje to Belgrade. And we were going on the bus, and bus was an absolute disaster. I didn't have a proper seat. I was so frustrated. I came to Skopje, and there I sit and I'm eating. We are sitting and we're eating 2 pizzas we've ordered. And there's this little boy, Roma boy, who comes and he wants to ask for something to eat. And I don't know where I am, what happened to me, that bus ride must have gotten to me, and I just brush him off. And I feel terrible for doing that. I see my wife looking at me, and she thinks this is really bad, really bad. Then we go up and have a bus ride from Skopje to Belgrade, and I'm now frustrated about everything on that bus ride. And we arrive, and I had the worst of all of our arguments with my wife because I was so bad-tempered. I think that little boy was at the center of my bad temper and my inability to kind of overcome. What would have happened to that journey had I said, "Oh, let's pull another seat. I order you a pizza. Come sit with us. We are here in a bus station." The whole thing would have been transformed. I would have been transformed, and the whole situation would have been transformed. And I sometimes think that this aporophobia, which was at work in significant degree in my own experience, is what's holding us back. And so I think it's a deeply spiritual, it's structural issue, no doubt about that. It's cultural, broadly cultural issue, but it's deeply spiritual issue. And on all 3 of these levels that I've just named, structural, spiritual, cultural, and spiritual, we have to work to elevate the poor and change ourselves.
Well, thank you. You've named I'll come to you in just a second. You've named a Christian tradition that that challenges these distorted moral narratives like Elizabeth was describing. I think we're all aware this week that, like, if a very simple articulation of that Christian vision in a sermon is presented to some politicians, there's a sort of violent response. I mean, there's a rejection of that narrative that happens. But that is there in the Christian tradition and in other traditions as a resource for creating this new will. And part of what we want to talk about is sort of what role folks here and our communities can play in building that will. So, Alan, you jump in, and then I want to bring folks here in the room in while we still have time.
Sure, just quickly. Fear of the poor. But during the pandemic, we reduced poverty by half through legislation, child tax credit legislation. so we can do it. And I don't know if the legislators were afraid of the poor, but they did it. And then 2 years later, the legislation lapsed and they didn't reauthorize it. So poverty went down by half, and then it increased by the same amount. What does that say about fear of the poor?
What's maybe interesting that it was not specifically motivated by elevating of the poor, but it took pandemic in order to motivate the action, so that this was almost like a consequence of motivation to do something different.
And did it not take John Kennedy to be assassinated for Lyndon Johnson to pass the Great Society legislation? So are we an amoral country that just is pragmatic for a while and then we forget about things?
As I go to our broader community here, and feel free to raise your hand if you have a comment or thought. Elizabeth, we were talking before, like, as a historian, what do you say about the potential for change, maybe even when things look at their worst?
Yeah, so, on this moment, I think one of the things that people are talking about a lot, and it's kind of like the vibe, the mood in 2020, not 2020, oh my gosh, 2016, a lot of people were amped up for resistance, and now it seems like there's kind of more of a resignation. But history reminds us, right, this is not, and some people are like, just think everything is doomsday. I can't go there, in part because history tells us that it's not. There's like, change is always possible. When people think that something is totalizing and it's forever and it's, messed up the nation, that's not the case. Nobody in 1860 would have expected or predicted that within 5 years slavery would be abolished. And that's one of the most, profound transformations in U.S. society, even if we haven't really completely lived up to the promise of emancipation. But I think one of the things that's keeping me going right now is that, we keep fighting and we keep imagining and we keep educating ourselves and pushing for change, because history shows us that it can be there and it will be there, and we can lay the groundworks now to think about what would it take to get that child tax credit enacted, and to give and to redistribute resources in this country. I think part of the tactic is to make people feel helpless, to make people feel like they can't do anything, to make people feel that it's inevitable. And one of the big things about that history shows us is that nothing is inevitable, and that the capacity for change is in each of us, and it is mass mobilization, working in community, in alliance, in coalition, in partnership, and in love that creates new societies, and that creates change, and that dismantles structures of oppression. So that's one of the ideas that's keeping me going, one of the big lessons from history.
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, give her a hand. Amen. I see some of our students here. We were talking in class just this week about how we were reading Danielle Allen's great work on the Declaration of Independence, and she talks in there about how in democratic conversations we need experts, but everyone is equal in their capacity to name how what's going on impacts them, right? So we need everyone's voices with experts weighing in. So we have some experts here, but we need everyone's voices. We need folks to weigh in. How does this land where you are? So who'd like to join the conversation? Esther?
Thank you so much for speaking and sharing your research and hard work and insights. My name is Esther. I'm a first-year student at the Div School. I came here directly from a fellowship in Congress. And I am wondering a lot about the last comment made about how we have such a tendency to look up, whether it's fear of what might happen if we look down or whether we might be dragged down. And I can't help thinking about how there's such a strong desire to also look for solutions by looking up and thinking about scale and impact and big picture, because that's what's going to create the most change for the most number of people. And I'm wondering, is there a way to navigate, any insights or stories, is there a way to navigate the tension between looking up in a positive, constructive way with the mentality maybe of like people who are below or like down, or will there always be a crisis of proximity? There's so many people who are working on, I was on like a SNAP portfolio, right? Like there were so many people who I was working with who have never been on food programs, right? Or who have not had these experiences, but still want to advocate. I think my poetry professor, Chris Wyman here, was also talking last week in class about how there's such an assault on individual consciousness that's happening. And I also think I saw a lot of that when I was working in government. Like when you look up, there's an assault on individual consciousness, things being subsumed for the greater good, for the bigger picture. And so this tension between look down, maybe work on your locality, your own spheres, versus work for impact and for big picture.
Just quickly, I think in some sense looking down is identifying with what is down. And then the question becomes, what are the modes and ways in which we can best impact, best create change? And my sense is that we need to work at all three of these levels that I mentioned: systemic, cultural, and also very, very personal. And part of the reason for giving the story of myself is the importance, is to emphasize the importance of personal. So up and down here are slightly differently were slightly differently meant.
I think part of it is amplifying the voices of and doing everything that we can to support the amplification of the most marginalized groups among us. And I think we've seen again and again the way that when that amplification happens, we can get change, whether it's from, like Michael Harrington's work and all the new studies about poor people. I mean, I think part of it is, putting people in the driver's seat to tell their own testimony, to share their own testimony and tell their own stories. That helps build wide support for the war on poverty, or, thinking about in the years leading up to abolition, the way that the narratives and testimony of enslaved people really helped move the needle and build awareness of what was actually going on in the slave system, behind the veil of the Southern planters' propaganda. So I think part of it is that, and again, the threat of these stories, these histories being told has been under attack, especially since 2020, right, which is the height of mass mobilization in this country, when the vast majority of Americans were asking new questions about police brutality and systemic racism and all of these things. The response to that was to call it woke, was to shut it down, was culture war, which I think also reflects the power of this kind of growing awareness and the potential power of continuing to amplify these stories and these experiences, these voices that are intentionally kept from us. The barriers in our society prevent us from understanding common ground, from empathizing with one another, from empathizing with people who we may not come into contact with, in part due to stratification and inequality in our society, and that works to preserve the status quo. So, one step is, again, trying to amplify those voices, trying to amplify the experiences of people who may be very far from those decision-making rooms, from Congress to, the local city hall.
Our daughter is 28. She lives in London, and she's always telling me, "Oh, Dad, you're a 1960s guy. You're trying to save the world, but London is so cool, and so and I have my my art friends, and I'm going to enjoy life." And I say, "Miranda, you can't do that." And so we have that. You're asking one of the most basic questions of our age, and certainly, I don't know, your kids are 3 and 5. Maybe you'll be having some dialogues like that in 10 years. I don't. So I don't have a good response other than to say that you got to engage this struggle, and you cannot lose track of progress if it takes 10 years, if it takes 100 years, if it takes 1,000 years. We must move forward, and we must move on, and we can't give up. And we need to be practical as well as spiritual. And maybe Yale should have a new degree that, which integrates theology and running for Congress. And one of the
I like that too. We're getting a PhD.
One of the leaders of the anti-gun group that evolved from the massacre in Florida is a young man. I forget his name, but he's the youngest member of Congress now, and he's as moral as you can get. But you must know his name. He's like 28, about the age of my daughter. And now he's been elevated. He's I think deputy leader of one of the caucuses. Anyway, he's rising quickly, and he's being listened to, and he's combining morality with politics.
Alan, you'll be glad to know that in addition to studying public theology here at the Divinity School, we also partner, the center partners with the Yale Campaign School, so that people who want to run for office can get all the toolkit they need. Right down at the law school, actually. Virginia wants to join the conversation.
Thank you so much. Professor Hinton, when you were talking about the federal government offering the communities to build prisons, I was reminded of Lyndon Johnson offering communities to build low-income housing through the New Towns in Town initiative, and the only community that took it was his own city of Washington, D.C. So I guess my question is, what can we do in our local communities to make them accept low-income housing instead of prisons?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I mean, I think part of it is demanding low-income housing. I mean, I think about what's going on in Connecticut, many towns outside of New Haven, when there's like real resistance. Again, going back to this aporophobia, real resistance to have multifamily housing in communities like Woodbridge. So I think part of it is being open to the idea and mobilizing people around the idea of having more mixed income communities where everybody can live together and thrive, organizing around that. Again, when you amplify voices of people who are unhoused or who are housing insecure, that helps build empathy among people, and they say, oh, actually, okay, maybe this won't be so bad if we have multifamily housing in our community. Maybe that would be a good thing, and there's a lot of ways that our communities can benefit from having more socioeconomic diversity. So, I think part of it is building awareness around the issue and then mobilizing people to act around it. We often forget, one of the things I really try to instill in my classes all the time is that, it's not like the Civil Rights Act or the War on Poverty or any, just dropped from thin air. It's the result of decades of organizing. And I think that's the other, thing. We're kind of in this age where, it's like instant gratification, like 30-second, tweet or TikTok video or whatever it is. And, that's why the history of the movement is so important, because it takes decades. You might not get the kind of victories that you want immediately, but you have to think of it, okay, I'm building, I have to be patient, I have to go slow, I have to really build strong coalitions in order to realize the goal. I mean, I think, and this is straying away a little bit from your question, but I think those of us who are working to build a better society, those of us who are in the movement, recognize we might not see the fruits of our labor in our own lifetime. And my children, my 3-year-old and my 5-year-old might not see the fruit of the labor. I hope my great-grandchildren, my grandchildren, my great-great-grandchildren can. And so I think it's always also having a long view and accepting the fact that, the kinds of major social transformations that are necessary, whether it's expanding housing for people or whether it's establishing the Department of Democracy. I would also like there to be a Department of Community Empowerment. That's going to take time, that's going to take dedication and commitment and doing the very hard work of organizing. And not just on social media,
Thank you. We got one more voice here in the back row that wants to jump in.
Hi, I'm Judah. I'm actually a student at Union Theological Seminary. And mostly a comment. I just want to thank you for bringing in mass incarceration to this conversation. I think it's so important. It's such a critical intersection of everything that we're talking about. And I can't help but think, as a person of faith, in scriptures, we hear Jesus say, I was in prison and you visited me, right? And if you come from a context where your job is to bring something, theology, to a place, you forget that there's actually something already there, and that's the people. And in the Christian tradition, that's Jesus, right? And so I think there's something about recognizing that there's voices that we're missing from even this conversation. So I appreciate you including my voice, but recognizing that my voice is actually only a piece of the millions of folks who are missing from our society. And I really believe that some of the answers to these questions in public theology and public policy, we've actually removed them from the conversation. So I just think about, how do we continue, and I have ideas in my own life, but how do we as people who are in the free world having these conversations bring the voices of those who've been removed from the ability to share their ideas to these solutions, and how do we make sure the commissions and other folks hear from those voices as well? So maybe not a question you can answer, but certainly something I think that's an important part of the conversation.
Thank you.
When I was a political appointee at HUD during the Carter administration, we went to Bed-Stuy, the Bedford-Stuyvesant Community Development Corporation. There was a whole tradition led by Bed-Stuy and then Ford Foundation to build houses via nonprofits. We have CDC models that are available. We don't have the funding for them. We further developed through James Rouse and the Enterprise Foundation and through the local initiative support corporations, nonprofit entities that built housing for the poor. That model also worked. We have many models today of housing integration, for example, in Washington, D.C., outside of Washington. In other words, there are the models for housing the poor, but we don't have the will to scale up those models because housing so often involves issues of race.
I really appreciate that question, so thank you. I would just say it's our responsibility to, back to the amplifying voices, not to sound like a broken record, but to make sure that we're being inclusive in our discussions and centering people who have firsthand experience in those discussions. One of the big slogans in the Justice Impacted People's movement is that there's power in proximity, and I really believe that. And I think in order to get out of this massive inequality that we are facing in this country, it's going to take a range of different expertise, and it's going to take a recognition that we all have something unique and important to bring to the table. And as we are building to dismantle many of the hierarchies that alienate us and that infuriate us, we have to be very conscious not to be recreating those hierarchies in the work that we do. So I think it's incredibly important that we move in that kind of fellowship, community, and inclusivity. And especially, you know, as a scholar of mass criminalization, you know, and everything I do, from the panels that I organize to the people that I'm in partnership with and learn from, I always try to center and amplify the voices of justice impacted people themselves. So I think that's, you know, in our work, it's something that we all need to be very cognizant of.
Well, we've come to the end of our time, but I know everybody here will want to join me in thanking each of you. So thank you very much. Again, if you want to continue in, you know, this conversation, which can go much deeper in terms of the details of all these policies and the way to the new will, the book, the resource that this conversation has been based on is called Creating Justice. For those of you who are in the room, we welcome you to get something to drink here afterwards and spend a little time of fellowship. Before we formally close, I just want to make 2 quick announcements about upcoming events that the center has. One is this coming Monday. Bishop Barber will be the university's MLK speaker for this year in Battelle Chapel. And I think whether you want to be in the chapel or watch it online, you need to register. So for those of you watching online, you can register from wherever. I believe it's open to the general public. But you have to register to get the link for that. That's next Monday evening. And then in about a month, on February 27th, is a Thursday afternoon, here at Yale Divinity School, the center is going to have our first Pellis McShirley Egwavin lecture. And you all will be honored to know that in the room tonight, Roz Pellis, for whom this lecture is named, with some of her colleagues who have been great movement lawyers in the movement. Anyway, we want to have a lecture that really brings our center in conversation with the law school regularly. So we're doing this, and one of Elizabeth's colleagues and a graduate of the Yale Law School will be there, and we'll be talking about how policy around property tax has and the racist policy around property tax has led many people to lose their homes. So that's based on the book Plundered that is coming out or just out, and we'll be talking about it. So all that coming up. Please stay in touch with us at the center. Thank you for those of you who joined us online, and for those in person, good to be with you. Thank you.
Great, yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for organizing.
That was, I really enjoyed this.
Yeah.